the world has stopped. In the most powerful rooms on the planet, hardened faces tremble. An African leader has just done the unthinkable, and in 48 hours, everything changes. Experienced leaders, accustomed to dictating the rules, now watch in silence, somewhere between shock and admiration. Who is he? If you like stories that turn the tide of geopolitics, sign up now, because this one, you need to follow through to the end. In the velvet-lined rooms where the fate of the world was often debated with calculated politeness, a piece of news arrived like an unexpected bolt of lightning, shattering the atmosphere of predictability. The name of IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, once a distant echo from an African nation in transformation, now resonated with a force that forced the most powerful global leaders to lean in and listen closely. What had initially been seen as a regional event, an internal upheaval in a distant country, began to reveal the contours of something much larger, something that challenged old certainties and geopolitical manuals. The initial puzzlement on the faces of seasoned diplomats and heads of state, discreetly captured by attentive aides, quickly gave way to intense curiosity, bordering on grudging admiration. It was unusual for an emerging leader, especially from a nation with modest resources and outside the main axes of power, to capture the global imagination so abruptly and profoundly. The news that was coming in spoke not of spectacular military achievements or miraculous economic discoveries, but of something more subtle and, perhaps for that very reason, more impactful, a new form of leadership. IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, with his calm demeanor and direct words, presented a stark contrast to the fiery rhetoric or cynical maneuvers that often dominated the international scene. He did not seek the limelight or flattery, but focused with singular determination on rebuilding his nation, basing his actions on principles of justice, transparency, and popular sovereignty that seemed almost antiquated in their sincerity, and therefore revolutionary. This disconcerting authenticity began to disarm skeptics and intrigue observers. Early analyses by international intelligence services and think tanks struggled to categorize him. He did not fit the traditional mold of a populist, a liberal reformer, or an enlightened autocrat. He had an unusual mix of radical pragmatism and idealism anchored in the reality of his people. His decisions, often bold and unexpected, did not seem to follow a predefined ideological script, but rather an internal logic focused on the well-being of his people and the dignity of his nation, which confused analysts. Global astonishment began to crystallize when the first tangible results of his leadership began to be independently reported. Previously obscure public accounts became transparent, damaging government contracts were reviewed or cancelled, and a genuine effort to combat endemic corruption began to bear visible fruit, with previously untouchable figures being brought to justice. This demonstration that it was possible to break vicious cycles of mismanagement, even in challenging contexts, reverberated far beyond the borders of his country. Leaders of developed nations, accustomed to dictating terms and observing the so-called Global South, with a certain paternalistic condescension, suddenly found themselves in the position of apprentices, or at least of very attentive observers. The way Traoré mobilized his people, not with empty promises but with a call to shared responsibility and hard work, was a spectacle of civic leadership rarely seen. There was a dignity and purpose that emanated from his actions, which rubbed off on his people. International financial institutions, which for decades had imposed their recipes and conditions, often with disastrous results for local populations, suddenly found an interlocutor who did not easily bow to external pressure. IBRAHIM TRAORÉ negotiated based on the interests of his country, questioning economic dogmas and seeking solutions adapted to its reality, a stance that caused both discomfort and forced respect in certain circles of global power. Perhaps what most astounded the world was the simplicity and moral clarity of his vision. In an increasingly complex, cynical, and fragmented global landscape, where truth seemed a negotiable commodity, his message of integrity, sovereignty, and self-reliance resonated with unexpected force. He spoke a language that transcended cultural and political barriers, appealing to a universal yearning for justice and leadership that truly served the common good. Veteran diplomats, in private conversations, admitted that it had been a long time since they had seen a political phenomenon like this. It was not a new ism or a military threat, but a living example that a different path was possible, a path that placed human beings and national dignity at the center of its priorities. For some, this realization was inspiring. For others, it was deeply disturbing, because it questioned the foundations of their own power. The name of Ibrahim Traoré began to be mentioned in the halls of the UN, at World Economic Forums and in academic debates, no longer as an exotic curiosity, but as a case study of a transformative leadership that emerged from where it was least expected. The world, accustomed to looking to certain centers of power for direction, now found itself with its eyes fixed on an African nation, watching with a mixture of incredulity and fascination the unfolding of a story that promised to redefine paradigms. The shock was not limited to surprise. It also involved a considerable dose of forced reassessment. Leaders of nations with centuries of diplomatic tradition and economic power were confronted with a style of governance that, at its core, exposed the ineffectiveness or hypocrisy of many established practices. Ibrahim Traoré was not playing the usual political game. He seemed intent on redefining the rules himself, starting in his own backyard but with an impact that rippled far beyond his borders, challenging the global status quo. One of the first demonstrations of this unique approach came at a high-level international forum. While other leaders were getting bogged down in polished speeches full of euphemisms and vague promises, Traoré took the podium and, with disconcerting calm, presented a stark diagnosis of the historical exploitation of his continent and proposed concrete solutions based on self-determination and fair cooperation, not dependence. His words, stripped of rhetorical artifice, fell like stones into a still lake, generating a reflective silence in the assembly. He did not beg for handouts or pose as a victim. Instead, he spoke of the inherent wealth of his people and his continent, not just in terms of natural resources but in human capital and cultural resilience. He demanded respect and genuine partnerships where benefits were mutually shared, openly challenging leonine arrangements that had perpetuated poverty and instability for generations. This firm stance, coming from a leader of a nation once considered peripheral, was deeply disturbing to many. Domestically, Traoré's reforms were equally bold and, to outside observers, astonishingly effective in a short space of time. Mass literacy programs, using innovative methods and grassroots volunteerism, began to show impressive results. Infrastructure projects, once hamstrung by corruption and bureaucracy, were given new momentum, with an obsessive focus on transparency and community participation, ensuring that resources were actually being spent for the benefit of the population. The health system, previously precarious and accessible only to a privileged minority, was undergoing a radical restructuring, with an emphasis on preventive medicine and the training of community health workers, reaching remote rural areas that had never seen a doctor. These achievements, in a country with limited resources, began to attract the attention of international organizations and other developing nations, who saw in it an inspiring and replicable model, far removed from the standardized prescriptions of global organizations. What caused most admiration, and even a certain discomfort in some circles, was the way in which Traoré seemed immune to the pressures of large international conglomerates and powerful lobbies. Decisions about the management of natural resources, for example, were made based on the long-term national interest, even if this meant renegotiating or canceling contracts that were highly profitable for foreign companies but harmful to his country. This courage in placing sovereignty above immediate financial interests was almost unheard of. Leaders of other nations, especially those also struggling with the legacy of colonialism and neocolonial exploitation, began to see in Ibrahim Traoré not just an example, but a beacon. Delegations from several African, Asian, and Latin American countries visited his nation, not to ask for financial help, but to learn, to understand how he managed to mobilize his people and implement such profound changes with such scarce resources, in the face of internal and external resistance. Even in wealthy, established nations, where complacency often set in, Traoré's figure provoked uncomfortable debate. His successes in areas such as fighting corruption, promoting education, and improving public health on modest budgets raised questions about the efficiency and priorities of Western governments themselves, which had infinitely greater resources at their disposal. The comparison, even if implicit, was inevitable and for some embarrassing. The international media, initially skeptical or treating him as an exotic figure, began sending their most experienced correspondents to cover the TRAORÉ phenomenon. The reports, often tinged with surprise, described a country in turmoil, an engaged people, and a leader who seemed genuinely committed to social transformation, without the traces of megalomania or authoritarianism that so often accompanied reformist leaders in the past. There was an air of authenticity that disarmed cynicism. The global astonishment, therefore, was not only due to the rise of a new leader, but also to the living demonstration that another type of politics was possible. A politics based on integrity, popular participation, and the tireless pursuit of the common good, capable of generating concrete results and inspiring hope far beyond its own borders. The world, accustomed to power games and empty speeches, suddenly found itself faced with an example that forced it to question its own convictions and practices. Behind the scenes at major international summits, where decisions that shape the world are made in whispers and behind closed doors, Ibrahim Traoré's name became a frequent, and sometimes uncomfortable topic. Heads of state and foreign ministers, in private conversations, expressed a mixture of grudging admiration and a certain apprehension. Traoré's rise and the success of his domestic policies were beginning to create an awkward contrast with the realities of many other nations, including some considered established powers. Some leaders, especially those in countries facing crises of legitimacy or growing popular protests against corruption and inequality, looked at Traoré's example with a mixture of envy and fear. His ability to genuinely connect with his people, inspire confidence, and implement profound reforms without resorting to repression or cheap demagogy exposed the weaknesses and cynicism of his own regimes, making it harder to justify inaction or mismanagement. Some initially tried to downplay the phenomenon, attributing it to specific local circumstances or a passing personal charisma. However, as reports from independent observers and non-governmental organizations confirmed the solidity of the transformations underway in Traoré's nation, this dismissive narrative became increasingly unsustainable. The reality of the facts was stubborn and pointed to something deeper, a leadership that defied paradigms. Other leaders, more pragmatic or perhaps more self-assured, saw Traoré as an opportunity to learn. Discreet study missions began to emerge, not only from developing countries but also from rich nations, interested in understanding the participatory management methodologies, anti-corruption strategies, and social inclusion policies that were being implemented with surprising success. It was a tacit recognition that good ideas could come from anywhere, even where one least expected them. The way Ibrahim Traoré dealt with pressure from major powers and multinational corporations was particularly notable and the subject of intense debate. He did not adopt a hostile confrontational stance, but rather one of principled firmness. He negotiated with dignity, demanding that the interests of his people be respected, and did not hesitate to reject proposals that he considered detrimental to national sovereignty or sustainable development, even if this entailed short-term economic risks. Such courage was rare on the global stage. The impact of his actions began to be felt in trade, climate, and development forums. His nation's voice, previously almost inaudible, gained unexpected weight, backed by concrete results and leadership that demonstrated integrity. Delegates from other countries in the global south were encouraged by his example, finding in him an ally in the quest for fairer and more equitable international relations, challenging the long-standing imbalance of power. Prominent figures in global civil society, including Nobel laureates, renowned intellectuals, and human rights activists, began to publicly express their admiration for Ibrahim Traoré. They saw in him the embodiment of renewed hope for more ethical and human-centered governance, an antidote to the cynicism and despair that often permeated discussions of major global challenges. Their praise only further amplified global attention to the phenomenon. There was also some astonishment in the realization that Traoré seemed genuinely uninterested in the trappings of power and the accumulation of personal wealth. Reports described a simple lifestyle, an aversion to privilege, and an almost monastic dedication to work. In a world where so many leaders seemed to use their positions for personal gain, this attitude of authentic service was deeply moving and inspiring, resonating with ordinary people in every corner of the planet. The question hanging in the air in many capitals was whether the TRAORÉ model would be sustainable in the long term and whether it could be replicated in different contexts. There were, of course, skeptics who pointed to the challenges ahead, the inevitable internal and external resistance, and the difficulty of maintaining such a level of integrity and popular mobilization indefinitely. But even among the skeptics, there was a recognition that something remarkable was happening. Thus, what had begun as a distant surprise had become a global fascination, forcing leaders and opinion makers to confront their own assumptions about power, development, and leadership. IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, without actively seeking the world stage, had become a central figure in a much-needed debate about the future of global governance and the ways to build a more just and humane world for all its inhabitants. The shockwave caused by IBRAHIM TRAORÉ's leadership did not stop within political and diplomatic circles. It spilled over into the global public consciousness, capturing the imagination of ordinary citizens in many corners of the world. Stories of his bold reforms, his unwavering integrity, and the rebirth of his nation began to circulate on blogs, podcasts, and social media, often told with a tone of wonder and hope that contrasted with the pessimism that prevailed in so many other narratives about the state of the world. At universities from Berkeley to the Sorbonne, from Oxford to Tokyo, students of political science, international relations and development studies were debating the TRAORÉ phenomenon. Theses and academic papers began to appear, analyzing his leadership style, the impact of his policies, and the lessons that could be drawn for other contexts. He became, unwittingly, a living case study for a new generation hungry for examples of transformative and ethical leadership. The impact was particularly profound among activists and social movements fighting for social justice, human rights, and environmental sustainability in their own countries. TRAORÉ's story offered a glimpse that change was possible, even against all odds, and that the courage to challenge oppressive and corrupt systems could indeed yield tangible results. It served as a powerful antidote to the cynicism and sense of powerlessness that often afflict those working on the front lines of social change. People who had previously felt disconnected from politics or distrustful of leaders' ability to advance the common good suddenly found in IBRAHIM TRAORÉ a figure who restored some faith in the possibility of virtuous governance. His apparent lack of personal vanity, combined with a relentless focus on public service, resonated deeply with those who were tired of the empty promises and self-promotion of so many traditional politicians, offering an alternative model. Even in the corporate world, where the pursuit of profit often trumps ethical considerations, TRAORÉ's story generated debate. Some executives and entrepreneurs, especially those from the new generation more attuned to issues of social responsibility and sustainability, saw in his governance model elements that could inspire more conscious and purposeful management in the private sector as well. Transparency and a focus on collective well-being were beginning to be seen not as obstacles, but as potential vectors for long-term success. The outpouring of support and admiration came in many unexpected forms. Musicians wrote songs inspired by their journey, artists created works celebrating the rebirth of their nation, and independent filmmakers began planning documentaries to chronicle this extraordinary transformation. There was a sense that something historically significant was happening, and a desire to capture and share that story with the world. Of course, there were also dissenting, critical and skeptical voices, especially among those whose interests were thwarted by TRAORÉ's reforms or whose worldview was challenged by his success. Some accused him of naive populism, others predicted inevitable failure, and still others tried to discredit him with disinformation and conspiracy theories. But these voices seemed increasingly isolated in the face of the growing wave of positive recognition. Most notably, TRAORÉ did not appear to seek this global acclaim, nor to be distracted from his core purpose by it. He remained focused on his internal mission, on consolidating reforms, strengthening institutions, and ensuring that the benefits of the transformation reached all of his nation's citizens. His humility and dedication to hard work only increased the respect the world accorded him, for they demonstrated a rare authenticity. The TRAORÉ effect began to influence political debates in other countries. Candidates for public office in different parts of the world began to cite him as an example, promising to adopt similar principles of transparency, fighting corruption and focusing on the well-being of the people. Although not all of these promises were sincere or successful, the simple fact that Traoré had become a role model indicated a significant shift in the global political imagination. Thus, the initial astonishment of world leaders turned into a broader and more diffuse admiration that permeated different layers of global society. Ibrahim Traoré, without aspiring to such a position, had become a symbol of hope and a catalyst for deep reflection on the direction of leadership and governance in the 21st century, inspiring millions to believe that a better, more just and more humane future was indeed possible. Global admiration for Ibrahim Traoré was not just a passing sentiment or an intellectual fad. It began to translate into concrete actions and changes in attitudes on the part of several nations and international organizations. Governments that had previously maintained a skeptical or even hostile distance towards his nation began to seek rapprochement, interested in establishing new forms of cooperation based on mutual respect and shared goals, and recognizing the legitimacy and strength of his leadership. Global financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which have traditionally imposed austerity packages and neoliberal reforms, have been forced to rethink their approach to dealing with Traoré's country. His firm defense of his nation's economic sovereignty and the clarity of his development policies, focused on eradicating poverty and promoting self-sufficiency, have forced these institutions to adopt a more flexible and dialogic stance, something rarely seen. Development agencies in countries in the global north, which had often operated with a top-down logic, imposing their own models and priorities, began to listen more closely to the needs and proposals coming from the nation led by Traoré. A process of redesigning aid programs began, seeking to align external resources with the development strategies sovereignly defined by the country, valuing local knowledge and community participation as never before. One of the most notable effects was the strengthening of South-South ties. Countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America, inspired by Traoré's example and his advocacy of a more multipolar and just world order, intensified cooperation with each other. Trade agreements, technological exchanges and partnerships in areas such as health and education flourished, creating a network of solidarity and mutual learning that bypassed the traditional centers of power in the North. Even on complex issues such as climate change and international security, the voice of Ibrahim Traoré and his nation began to be heard with renewed respect. His approach, which combined a commitment to environmental sustainability with the demand for climate justice for nations less responsible for the crisis but more vulnerable to its impacts, brought a moral and practical perspective that enriched the debates and challenged the inertia of the great powers. The global African diaspora, often marginalized and underrepresented, found in Traoré a source of immense pride and inspiration. His leadership demonstrated to the world the capacity and potential of the African continent when freed from the shackles of corruption and external exploitation. Many professionals and intellectuals from the diaspora were motivated to contribute their knowledge and resources to support the ongoing transformation process, strengthening the bonds between the continent and its children around the world. Internationally renowned universities and research centers began to establish partnerships with academic institutions in the nation of Traoré, interested in learning from the social and political innovations that were flourishing there. Scholarships were created, student and faculty exchange programs were implemented, and joint research projects were launched, fostering an exchange of knowledge that benefited both parties and broke down old stereotypes. Tourism, which had been in its infancy and focused on a few attractions, began to grow sustainably, attracting a new type of visitor, people interested not only in exotic landscapes, but in witnessing social and political transformation up close, in learning about local culture and in interacting with the people who had rediscovered their dignity and purpose. This conscious and respectful tourism generated income and promoted genuine cultural exchange. Even ethical investors and social impact funds, which seek to align their financial returns with positive social and environmental outcomes, began to look with interest at the opportunities that were emerging in Traoré's nation. Political stability, transparency in public management, and a commitment to sustainable development created a more favorable environment for investments that could contribute to the country's long-term prosperity, in contrast to the predatory exploitation of the past. In this way, The initial amazement and admiration began to materialize into constructive engagement and a reconfiguration of the international relations of Ibrahim Traoré's nation. The world not only watched with fascination, but also began to adapt and respond positively to the emergence of this new moral and political force on the global stage, recognizing that something truly transformative and inspiring was happening under his leadership. Ibrahim Traoré's legacy, still under construction, was already emerging not only through the internal transformations of his nation, but through the profound and lasting impact his leadership had on the imagination and political practices on a global scale. The world, once surprised then in awe, was now beginning to internalize the lessons of his journey, recognizing that the example of one man and one people could indeed inspire a fundamental rethinking of the paths to a more just and sustainable future for all humanity. The story of his rise from an ordinary citizen driven by a deep sense of justice to the leadership of a nation in rebirth became a powerful narrative against cynicism and apathy. It demonstrated that integrity, courage, and dedication to the common good were not utopian ideals but tangible qualities that could shape reality and inspire millions of people to believe in the possibility of change, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their example forced leaders around the world to confront their own consciences and question their government's priorities. The mere existence of a transparent, participatory, and effective governance model, even in a context of limited resources, served as an uncomfortable mirror for those who clung to corrupt, inefficient, or authoritarian systems. The comparison was inevitable and, for many, inspiring reform. The Traoré effect did not just inspire protests or political reforms. It also sowed the seeds of a new culture of hope and civic responsibility. Ordinary citizens across the globe felt emboldened to become more actively involved in the public life of their communities and nations, to demand more from their leaders, and to work together to build more just and resilient societies. The idea that every individual has a role to play in building a better world gained new traction. For future generations of leaders, especially in developing countries, Ibrahim Traoré became a beacon of light. His ability to resist external pressures, to prioritize the interests of his people, and to build authentic and sovereign development offered an alternative path to dependence and submission. He proved that it was possible to forge one's own path, based on national dignity and social justice, without succumbing to the traps of neocolonialism. The debate on the future of democracy and global governance has been profoundly enriched by his experience. Traoré demonstrated that true democracy goes far beyond regular elections. It requires ongoing popular participation, radical transparency, accountability of rulers, and an unwavering commitment to the rights and well-being of all citizens, especially the most vulnerable. His political practice challenged formal and often empty models of democracy. Even if not all nations could exactly replicate Traoré's model, due to their historical and cultural particularities, the fundamental principles of his leadership, integrity, service, sovereignty, and justice, resonated universally. They offered a set of timeless values that could guide political action in any context, inspiring a constant search for more humane and effective governance at all levels. A world often divided by ideological conflicts, geopolitical disputes, and economic inequalities found in Ibrahim Traoré a rare point of convergence, an example of leadership that transcended borders and cultures, appealing to the best in human nature. His story was a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of hope can emerge from where it is least expected, illuminating the path to a brighter future. The true measure of his global impact, however, would not be seen only in the corridors of power or on the pages of newspapers, but in the hearts and minds of millions of people who, touched by his story, rediscovered faith in politics as an instrument of social transformation and in the capacity of ethical leadership to inspire the world. Ibrahim Traoré not only surprised the globe, he invited him to dream of a better future and work to make it a reality. Thus, the journey of one man and his nation became an inspiring chapter in the long history of the human quest for dignity, justice, and self-determination. Initial amazement gave way to profound admiration and, finally, to a transformative reflection on the kind of leaders and world we aspire to build, leaving a legacy of hope that would echo for generations to come, far beyond the borders of his country and his time. And so the story of Ibrahim Traoré shows us that one individual, guided by strong principles and love for his people, can not only transform a nation, but inspire the entire world to rethink what is possible. If this story has touched something in you, if it has made you reflect on the power of leadership and hope, then our goal has been achieved. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue receiving stories that make us think and feel. Leave your like if you also believe that examples like this can change the world, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is very important to us. Thank you very much for following us, and until the next inspiring story,